Well, there's a party here tonight.
Hey everyone, I'm Kathy Kiley, president of the Ad Club, and welcome to another episode of the podcast Between Milk and Water. So we're doing these podcasts because hopefully all of you know by now, we have the Women's Leadership Forum coming up, and we're going to be live streaming the Women's Leadership event on July 9th. So I'm excited. We're partnering with PNC Bank. And so what we decided to do was turn our attention to some of the outstanding female leaders that live and work in the Boston community. So think about the fact that we are now living in the midst of an amazing, eye-opening world, the global events, and nothing plays a more pivotal role in these times than accurate and intelligent journalism. So with that in mind, we are delighted to have our favorite journalist, my personal favorite journalist, the one and only Lisa Hughes with us today. Lisa is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and she's the anchor. You all know her from WBZ-TV News. So Lisa, welcome to Between Milk and Water.
Kathy, so nice to be with you.
Yeah, nice to have you here. I said to you earlier, you're the last thing I see at night before I go to bed. So it's great to see you in broad daylight. But I have to tell you, I have sympathy for you because I'm sitting here. I have no shoes on, which is my first podcast I've done barefoot. But I'm in awe of you. You still have to every day. You look beautiful. You have to turn it out and turn it on. And so my heart goes out to you as I get slobbier and messier as we go into the week 9 or whatever week we're in.
Well, I have to tell you, it actually has been, I have friends who said, oh my gosh, like you actually have to get dressed for work. But the ability to go into a job every day since this started, and forgive me, that's a 12-week puppy in the background.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, maybe he'll make a cameo at some point. But the idea that I've been able to go in every day has actually been a blessing, because from the very beginning of the pandemic, it made me feel like there was some normalcy. And at a time when very few things seem normal, to have a schedule was sort of some semblance of what was. And I have really appreciated that.
Well, someone said to me, do you miss being on stage? And I said, oh, God, no. That was like in the other world, in our prior world, that was always my stress point. Like, oh God, I have to be on stage. So now that I'm comfortable with this technology, I'm good. If I never put on shoes again, I'd be a happy woman.
Think how happy your feet will be, right? I mean, they'll be like, oh, this is how they were meant to be, not shoved in those little shoes with those high heels.
Right. Exactly. My feet are very happy. So you and I had a fun prep call for this, but it happened right before the pandemic hit. So it was a while ago. But I remember the funniest thing was you said you were born in Moscow. So I wanted you to give a little explanation of being born in Moscow.
Right. So I was born in Moscow, Idaho, which if I don't say Idaho very quickly after saying Moscow, people think it's very exotic. Which it is lovely, but exotic it is definitely not. It's a college town about 5 hours from Seattle, and not at all a place of great intrigue.
But you weren't there that long, right? You and I walked through your story a little bit, and I said something and you laughed, but after hearing your whole story, I said there was a thread, a commonality through many of your big life moments that were wrapped in disaster, that had a disaster thread through them. And whether you were winning awards or you were getting married, or there was this interesting thread. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think I want to film your movie. I want to make the movie about you.
I think it would be an emotional roller coaster, definitely. So I went to school at the University of Washington in Seattle, and my first job was in Coos Bay, Oregon, which I had never been to until I actually interviewed for the job. The interview took place at the station, which was in a military-style Quonset hut that had been converted into a television station. And I was there for about a year, went to Boise, Idaho, and then went back to Seattle, Washington, where I was a weekend anchor and a reporter. And probably the defining story of my time as a young journalist there was the Oklahoma City bombing. And I'll never forget it, working a morning shift as the morning anchor, filling in for a woman who had not yet arrived. And the man who was running the station at the time, we saw the video of the explosion or of the aftermath. Yeah. And the man who was running the station at the time came into the newsroom and he said, I need 5 people who can be ready to leave in 1 hour with a bag packed for an undetermined amount of time. And as luck would have it, I lived blocks from the station. And I said, I can do it. I mean, I don't have anywhere else I have to be but here. And I had a neighbor who could take care of my cat. And so we left. And that was really my first experience with covering a terrorist act and a national tragedy. And those kinds of experiences would leave an indelible mark on anyone. You know, I'm sure whether you are a police officer or a journalist or whatever, if that's your first experience of that magnitude, you never forget it. And one of the things that struck me then and has struck me in every subsequent disaster is how people rise up. You know, people who are members of the community, people who come from outside the community to be helpful. I just remember the Red Cross walking around the sort of farm of live trucks, just checking to make sure that reporters had food because you couldn't leave. And it was just so incredibly thoughtful at a time when everyone in their community was dealing with this collective tragedy. So I would say that was sort of the first one. And since then, I flew over the towers on 9/11 and was there for 5 days. I wasn't there to cover a tragedy. I was there for a meeting that was supposed to bring me back to Boston by 8 o'clock that night. And then I was, because the station, WBZ, covers the Boston Marathon as a live event, a live sporting event, and a community celebration. I was on the photo bridge when the first of the 2 bombs went off on Boylston Street.
So in this all, which I thought is such a nice story, and go back for a minute to the 9/11, because that's how you met your husband in a long term, in an unraveling, longer story. So just because I think that's such a beautiful personal story, so just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely in a roundabout sort of way. So my husband's first wife was on the first plane on 9/11, and I did not know them at the time, but we had a lot of mutual friends, and a mutual friend of ours with whom I worked at the time said, have I got a guy you got to meet? And I said, okay. I mean, I'm open. If you like him, I'm sure I would like him. And he said, I was open, at that point I thought, you know what, why not? I've got nothing to lose here. And I felt very adventurous, just saying, fabulous. And I said, do me a favor, don't tell me anything about him. Just let me meet him. And he paused and said, well, that is impossible. There are a few things about him that you definitely need to know. And I said, that's going to ruin it, because you're going to tell me and then I'm going to get an idea of what he's like. And he said, yes, but if I don't give you some background, you will hate me. And so he shared with me the outline of Mike's story. And I thought to myself, if he can be brave enough at this point, and if he is emotionally healthy enough to feel like he can go out, then I got to meet this guy. And I remember at the time thinking, I mean, it's not like I'm going to marry him. So what's the, of course I'm going to go on a date with him. And to this day, like when we told our kids that story at one point, and my son to this day will say, and don't you remember when you said to yourself, I'm not going to marry him? See, mommy, sometimes you're wrong.
That's great. That's very cute. That's a nice story. So the other thing that I loved last time we spoke was your you've wanted to be a journalist your whole life. I mean, from a really young age, and you had a mentor of sorts who is perhaps fictional, but someone who inspired you early in your life to go into journalism. Tell everybody a little bit about that.
Well, it is strange, and I definitely didn't at the very beginning. I didn't realize it. I think it's true that from a really young age, there was nothing else I wanted to do but be a journalist. And in retrospect, my parents are both English teachers. So my mom is a retired English teacher, and my dad was an English professor, now retired. And so our house was full of books, and writing was something I always really enjoyed. But I think the more influential piece, or equally influential piece, was that because I grew up not just in Moscow, Idaho, but technically 8 miles outside of Moscow, Idaho, on like a hillside, we didn't have cable. I don't even think it was available to us in the sticks in those days. And so we got 2 channels. We got PBS and we got CBS. So I would start my day with Sesame Street, and then every night at whatever it was, 6 o'clock or 6:30, we watched the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And this was a big deal in our house, and we could talk a lot, but we couldn't talk when the news was on, except during the commercial breaks, because my parents didn't want to miss anything. And I soaked all of this in, and then I saw the skit where Kermit the Frog is at the airport in the Edward R. Murrow trench coat reporting at something. And it must have just left this indelible impression, like, wow, this is really like a noble field. And if everybody from Kermit the Frog to Walter Cronkite and all those correspondents are doing this, this looks like a pretty good job.
Right. I love that story.
The Kermit piece didn't hit me until, maybe 20 years ago. Somebody said, what were your earliest influences? And all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, I now have to tell them it's Kermit the Frog. I suppose there are, worse influences. And he's still on the air, so good for him. He's got longevity.
He has a very long career. He has an exemplary career.
Right, and he never ages. Always youthful and energetic. But definitely, and the excitement that seemed to go hand in hand with that job, and we all know it's not always exciting, but particularly right now, it just feels so valuable. And I am so glad that I pursued it. I know no matter what profession you're in, there's going to be someone along the way who will say, as you're making that choice, well, that's really competitive. And I think you could say that certainly about any job. But I would say to anyone out there, any young person who's thinking about journalism, when someone tells you it's competitive, then you just say, great. I'll dig in and work that much harder.
Well, and for a woman in journalism, I think it's even more competitive. I think we've all heard so many horror stories, through journalism and what women have put up with, some of the more famous anchor women. And how would you say things have changed since you got into, and I know this is a wide open question, but how have things changed in the industry and for you since you started?
I think there are far more women in management positions and positions of power in the industry. And I think that has been one of the critical differences, in that there is a much broader range of life experiences that come to the table when decisions are being made. And that's critical. I think the ranks of women in all different kinds of journalism has also made a difference. When we're talking with doctors now about the coronavirus, or researchers, even the heads of companies, we're talking with men and women equally. And so I think we can be really proud that push to encourage girls in math and science is paying off in spades. Anyone who invested in that in time or capital is seeing the benefit of that now. And I think that while there is always to some degree a cultural double standard in the way that men and women are allowed to age, I also think that is changing and has definitely, and I think we see that in a really wonderful way in Boston, in that, the men and women can have very long careers in this business, and your time only makes you more valuable as both a resource and a trusted member of the community. And that is also really encouraging. I feel like, years ago when I started, you'd be much more likely to see a much older man and a very young woman anchoring together. And that was sort of, if not the expectation, it wasn't at all uncommon. And now the ages seem to matter much less.
Right. Thank God.
Thank God.
Yeah, that's great. However, though, you do stay annoyingly young looking. So we can talk about that offline because I want to love to know your secrets. But
My son would just say it's annoying. I am
so annoying how young you look. But these are difficult times. Talk about if you're going to age, you'll be aging now. Talk about what's happening in the newsroom for you right now in the midst of this current situation where every day you wake up and first of all, we have a president who's saying the press is the enemy of the people, and we have, a new issue. Suddenly, the coronavirus takes a back burner, which is astounding to me. And you're dealing with, everything the protests that are happening in the streets. What's your day like? How do you cope with all of this?
It is a lot, and it's interesting because I feel like when you and I spoke initially, right before this outbreak, it feels like that was a year ago, and it was like 3 months ago. So just from a sort of, just to give you, to lift the veil a little bit on what happens at the station, almost all of our reporters and photographers are working remotely. And there is a very small group of us actually going into the station. Even some of our newscast producers produce the newscast from home. And so you notice like our sports anchors, Steve Burton and Dan Roach, they're working from home. For a couple of months, Eric Fisher, our chief meteorologist, was out in front of the station. He's back in now, but he is the only person who has come back in, if I'm not mistaken, since this started. So for starters, the feel of the newsroom is very, very different now. And that took some getting used to because it's such a collaborative business and experience. And we're so used to bouncing ideas off each other and, yelling things in the newsroom that not to have that was really strange. David Wade and I, for example, my co-anchors, sit on 2 separate anchor desks that are 20 feet apart. And sometimes we will revert to our old habits and we'll turn to look at each other, not realizing that what it looks like on TV is that we're just looking off into space at a 90-degree angle. I did it last night. I'm like, he's in the double box with me. I don't need to turn my head to look at him or it looks ridiculous. So that's different. And then just the nature of the news itself. This was, most of us have never lived through anything like this. And when we were talking every day about, sickness and death and fear and job losses, it is so inherently painful. And, if the marathon bombing experience taught us anything here, it's that we are incredibly resilient in Greater Boston. And the way that we draw on each other for strength and the way that we come together by being apart, I just think is like, I'm so proud to live here. I love Massachusetts. I love living here. I'm so proud of people who live here and the way they handle crisis. And it has been an emotional roller coaster. I mean, when we've seen those stories of people going up to the windows in nursing homes so that they can be with their loved ones because it's the only way they can be with them. I mean, your heart breaks and it soars when people are released from the hospital and there's that, line of clapping and that sense of celebration. And I think it's so important to celebrate those victories. And we really do make an effort to, and this is true across the board, even not inside this pandemic, but we really do make an effort to share those positive stories too, because it's so important that people see the reflection of the good in their community as well as the areas where we need some work. And when the protests started, it was almost like initially you think, oh my God, this is one more painful thing. But the pain has been there. And I have come to really feel strongly that these protests, these huge protests, and by the protests, I am not talking about the looting or the violence, but the protests themselves are serving such a valuable function. And Kathy, I'm sure, I'm curious to see if you feel this way too, but it feels like, we're at a tipping point here. We're not going back. There is a cultural awareness about systemic racism that didn't exist as broadly as it does now. And it represents hope that we can change this. And,
Absolutely.
and that to me feels so hopeful. And when you see police and protesters together, whether the police officers are taking a knee or bumping elbows with a protester, like those are the moments where you're like, we can come together on this. And telling those stories is so critically important that if I were not telling them directly, I would feel like I was missing out on this moment in history. And I feel very privileged to be able to do this.
Well, yes, and I was very proud yesterday to witness the demonstrations and the how the city came together. And I think the mayor and the governor have done a really good job through it all, especially with the corona and the rest of it. So yes, I like you, I'm very proud to be a Bostonian. So you and I also, speaking of Bostonians and networking and connections, you and I have also been together. We are both on the board of the Big Sisters of Boston. But I'm in awe of all that you do. In my notes, it says not only the Big Sisters, but you're very tied to the PanMass Challenge. You've been involved with the Boys and Girls Club, Spalding Rehab Hospital, Project 35. You, like many prominent Boston women, are an overachiever. So how do you balance all that? Because you're so dedicated to the Big Sisters of Boston. How do you do that?
Well, I'm not sure I have achieved balance yet, but I'm still working on that.
Well, there's no such thing, so skip
exactly,
that.
Right? I mean, it's a nice aspiration, a good goal to have, and we're all works in progress. So, maybe someday. But I look at these, the organizations you just mentioned, and in different ways, they all strike a chord with me. So Big Sister Boston, I know you and I feel the same way about this, but it's the only Big Sister organization in the country that focuses exclusively on girls. And as women, we know the value in that, and that if girls can see it, they can achieve it. But you can't aspire to something that doesn't exist for you. And so being involved with an organization whose mission it is to find mentors, to create opportunities. I mean, our community is only better because of that. And I happen to love the members of the board so much because they're all so committed. So I sit in there and I think, wow, these are extraordinary people. I'm just lucky to be in the room. And I also feel that way. And I also feel that way about Spalding Rehab. I mean, after the marathon bombing, I felt like seeing survivors recover was a critical part of my recovery. And I'd be curious how many other people felt that way too. But having the ability when able, when we were allowed to go to Spalding Rehab and to see what those therapists were doing to help people regain their strength was so restorative for me and gave me such faith that they would be okay, I would be okay, we would all be okay, we would recover from this as a community. That and I gotta be honest, I didn't have an appreciation necessarily for rehab before that. But you think about your life and then losing the ability to do something that was first nature for you, and then being surrounded by a support system that's committed to getting you back there. I mean, that's a feat, and it's incredible, and it happens to be right here in our backyard. The PanMass Challenge, I didn't even know that I liked biking so much, but I do. I love it. It's totally my outlet now. And to think that by, and I will say, I think I struggle with the idea of soliciting people for money, even when it's something I believe in, just because as a journalist, you're used to laying out facts and then hoping that people will make good decisions based on those facts. You're not asking them to believe one thing or another. So when you're asking someone for money, it always feels like, oh, wow, I gotta tap into my network again. But like Big Sister Boston, like Spalding Rehab, the PanMass Challenge, is an organization, is an event that ensures that every penny of every dollar raised goes to Dana-Farber Cancer Research Institute, and that's pretty phenomenal. And so when you're raising last year $63 million, you can move the needle. I mean, sarcoma drugs and brain tumor drugs and all of these, we've got so many smart people here that to be able to give them the means with which to create new therapies and to see people walking around and thriving because those therapies exist, and you can draw the line, to the sweaty bike ride, that's really exciting. And it's so affirming. So, I think with all those groups, yes, you have to figure out where am I going to put my energy. And there are so many, we live in such a generous place with so many great organizations, but these happen to be the ones that really resonate for me. And the Boys and Girls Clubs of Dorchester, I mean, the fact that they are giving kids, so many kids, hundreds of kids, so many different opportunities to tap into arts and culture and tutoring resources. Like it's all what makes Greater Boston great.
Right. And your real love is the marathon, and that got put on hold. So I'm sure that felt like an odd moment when that didn't come around.
I have to say, I that was a gut punch, and not one that I wasn't expecting given what's happening in the world. But when it was delayed in April, you could say, well, okay, at least we'll get it in September, and the runners will get their opportunity to have this personal victory, and Greater Boston also won't miss out on the $200 million plus that go into the revenue as a result of the marathon. And then when it was canceled altogether for the first time in its history, it was like,
first time.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly since 2013, that race and the sort of the community gathering around it has been such a symbol of who we are that to lose it, you have to dig a little deeper. But if history has taught us anything, it's that it will be back bigger and better when we're all able to line the streets again.
It's an international event, and when it does come back, it'll come back bigger than ever. And it also, you have to remind yourself all the time, we are living history, and you'll be telling grandchildren about this. And so while not all of it is positive, it is all historic. So it's kind of mind-bending every day.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And Lisa, I want to be conscientious about your time, because I know you have to get to the news station, but you also have a 20-year anniversary coming up. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
which is
making history.
That is sort of amazing to me, because I can remember the first day that I walked into the station and working with Liz Walker and Jack Williams and Bob Bell and all of these icons of Boston television, and they really were my mentors. I feel really lucky to have worked with them. But yeah, it's I feel incredibly fortunate.
Great. Well, hopefully we will see you. I believe you're going to be speaking at the Women's Leadership Forum this year, so we're roping you into yet another event. But at the very least, I will be talking to you before that, and I can't thank you enough for being here, knowing your schedule and knowing how busy you are. So Lisa, thank you from all of us. And thank you to our listeners who have joined us again with another podcast brought to you by Pansy Bank, and we love them. Thank you for hosting and sponsoring. So we will see you all on July 9th at the Women's Leadership event. And Lisa, have a great news night, and thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me on, Kathy. I so appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Well, there's a party here tonight.